So in this video, we're going to go over moral skepticism. So roughly speaking, theories that are skeptical shed doubt on morality. So the first two theories that we're going to look at are egoistic theories. So the ego is the self, right? So these are theories that prioritize the self. So the first one is ethical egoism. That's the theory, the ethical theory that says that an action is morally right if and only if it maximizes one's self-interest. We also have psychological egoism. This is the psychological theory that states that the ultimate motivation behind every human action is the pursuit of self-interest. So these are both fairly strong theories, and they both make it so that the thing that we should do or the thing that we do is pursue our self-interest. They are slightly different, though. The first theory is ethical, so it's ethical in the sense that it's a theory of what we should do. So we should promote our self-interest. And the second theory, psychological egoism, is psychological. So it's a theory of what we in fact do. So we do pursue our self-interest. And more in a more extreme sense, pursuing our self-interest is the only thing that we do. So let's try to apply these theories. So just like we did with divine command theory, we'll try to figure out ethical egoism's answer to a trolley problem. So you're standing and get to choose, do 5 people die or does 1 person die? So ethical egoism's answer is pull the lever or not according to which action you think most benefits you. So because we're only supposed to pursue our self-interest, that's what we should do in a case like this too. So it may be possible that one of these options will give better results for us. So let's say the people that are lying on the track, let's say they promise to reward us. Maybe one person promises to reward us a lot of money and the 5 people promise to reward us even more money. Or the opposite, right? Though maybe the one person's a billionaire and they promise to give us $1 billion. So we can make this decision basically based on what we think benefits us, which one of these, and it's going to change depending upon the specifics of the case, right? So maybe one of those 5 people is your wife, or maybe that one person is your husband. So maybe you kill the 5 people to save your husband, or the opposite, right? Those are considerations that you might self-interestedly make because you have that special relationship with your wife or husband, and that means that you're going to prioritize that self-interested relationship. So what are some advantages of this theory? So we have a few candidates for advantages. The first advantage was what we might call the self-reliance argument. So the most effective way of making everyone better off is for each person to mind his own business and tend only to his own needs. So if we think that this is true, then that seems to be in favor of ethical egoism, though subtly it might actually not necessarily be, because if you notice, the self-reliance argument starts with the idea that the most effective way of making everyone better off. So ethical egoists don't care about everyone, right? They just care about themselves. So what you would have to you would have to modify here is you'd have to say the most effective way of making yourself better off is for each person to mind his own business. But actually, that doesn't seem like it would be true either, right? So, and it would also be begging the question, because you would just be assuming the ethical egoist position. And it doesn't seem true in the sense that if you're an ethical egoist, maybe you don't want people to mind their own business. Maybe you actually want them to just give you money all the time, right? To just serve you as like a king. So this is a possible advantage, but you would definitely have to modify the argument in order to make it work. Another argument is the libertarian argument. If I do not consent to help other people and have done them no wrong, then I don't have to help them, right? This argument also doesn't seem, strictly speaking, to be in favor of ethical egoism, because it's still assuming that there are conditions under which you have to help people, like consent and wronging them. In those conditions, you'd have to help them regardless of your self-interest. A true ethical egoist would want to say, well, no, I don't have to help people even when it's when I have consented to, and even when I've done them wrong, I don't have to help them anyway. All I have to do is what's for me. So you would have to alter this argument as well if you want to call it an advantage for ethical egoism. A third advantage of ethical egoism is the idea, the argument from the psychological. So if we can't be altruistic, then it can't be our duty to be altruistic. So this actually appeals to psychological egoism, because if we just can't be altruistic, if we're just selfish, and that's the fact, we're just selfish, we can't be anything otherwise, then yeah, it wouldn't be our duty to be altruistic, because we can't be expected to do. You can't be expected to do what you can't do, right? But this gets into psychological egoism, so it's actually not really an argument in favor of ethical egoism as well. So we could potentially find more advantages to ethical egoism. There's just sort of a general intuition that we are special to ourselves. And that just seems to be true intuitively to most people. And that specialness to ourselves seems like it would be reflected in some kind of a normative principle. So that could be a potential advantage not written here. But for the advantages written here, we'd probably have to give a little more justification as to why, or modification as to why they really would be advantages of ethical egoism as a theory. So what are some disadvantages? So one disadvantage seems to be just the general intuition that people have that sometimes we ought to commit self-sacrifice for the sake of others and not for ourselves. People generally think that this is what we ought to do. People have that intuition. People generally scowl at people who only act in their own self-interest all the time. So this seems to be a case where we actually have a reason to doubt ethical egoism. Ethical egoism is consistent with our intuition that we should protect ourselves, but it's not consistent with our intuition that sometimes we should protect others, basically. So let's look at psychological egoism next. What is psychological egoism's answer to the trolley problem? So the psychological egoist might say, pull the lever or not, you will inevitably do whichever action you think most benefits you. So this is similar to what the ethical egoist answered, but we're just replacing should with will. You will do it. The psychological egoist doesn't really think that we have a choice in the matter. Or if we do have a choice, the choice is just a choice amongst things that benefit us. And then when we find the thing that benefits us most, that's what we will choose, because it's the only rational thing to do. So what are some advantages of psychological egoism? So one thing to say would be the argument from our strongest desires. So whenever you're motivated by your strongest desire, you're pursuing your self-interest, is the basic thought. So this is just suggesting that psychologically, this is just what we do. We just pursue self-interest because we always are most motivated by our stronger desire. That is just definitional. But this doesn't actually seem like it's necessarily true. Maybe our strongest desire actually is to self-sacrifice. That would make this not an advantage for psychological egoism. So we'd have to explain this in a way that isn't begging the question. We'd have to explain why this is actually an advantage. We'd have to modify the argument a little bit. There's also the argument from expected benefit. So whenever you do something, you expect to be better off as a result, is the basic intuition. And we know that this is often true. So there's tons of things that we do for ourselves, and tons of things that we do for the betterment of ourselves. But is it always true that we expect to be better off? Certainly not in some cases, right? It seems like that we can look at specific cases where we do things and we know full well it's bad for us. That seems true as well. So we'd have to give some kind of an explanation of this as well as an advantage. In general, psychological egoism does satisfy this intuition that we have, that it just seems like we're compelled to do things that are good for us. But that sort of conflicts with obvious cases where we don't. So that's we'd have to somehow modify these advantages to really give a good sense of why psychological egoism is a good theory to hold. So psychological egoism also has disadvantages. We'll look at one disadvantage, which is that sometimes we do commit self-sacrifice for the sake of others and not for ourselves. So we've already mentioned this a little bit. These cases, let's say you jump on a grenade. That's the famous case of heroic self-sacrifice, right? You jump on a grenade to save the rest of the soldiers, the rest of the people around you. Now, the psychological egoist could say that these people who jump on grenades are only doing it for their benefit. It would be something like they're doing it so that they don't feel shame later. But at least in the case of a grenade, you're actually dying when you do it, presumably. It's hard to survive a grenade. So it's really hard to imagine a plausible way to be a psychological egoist here, you'd have to really gerrymander what it is to be, what your self-interest means. Because if you're actually dying, but that is in your self-interest, you'd really have to explain what that self-interest means. How is that your self-interest to die? The psychological egoist has ways of doing that, right? They could say something. They could tell a story like that you'll get famous, or that your family will be proud of you, or something like that. But it's hard. It's hard to imagine that those things are in the self-interest of the person who died, and that they didn't just die because they thought that they're going to be saving these other people. It may be true in some cases, right, that they jumped on a grenade for the glory or something. But in other cases, we might imagine that their desire to save the others was probably sincere. So let's look at some other theories of moral skepticism: relativism and error theory. So relativism is the view that there are no objective moral standards, and that all correct moral standards hold only relative to each person or each society. So I might have one moral standard, you might have another because you live in a different society, and other societies might have more moral standards. There might be as many moral standards as there are societies, and all of them are correct to that society. It's relative to the society. So error theory would be different. Error theory is the view that says that there are no moral features in this world, that no moral judgments are true. Our sincere moral judgments try and always fail to describe the moral features of things, and as a result, there is no moral knowledge. So unlike the relativist, who is saying that there are moral standards, just there's different moral standards for every society, the error theorist is saying, no, there are no moral standards, period, at all. Like we're just making it up. We're not actually talking about something that's real and true. We're talking about something that is fake and false, right? So when we are talking about morality as an error theorist, it's sort of like talking about unicorns. We know unicorns aren't real, but we can still make statements about unicorns. So I can say something like, unicorns have one horn. But I don't think that there are any actual unicorns in the world. And moral error theorists think that we're doing the same thing with morals. That we can say morals are real. It's wrong. It's wrong to kill people. But the error theorists would say, well, that's just like the unicorns. We're talking about something that doesn't exist. So what's relativism's answer to the trolley problem? It would be something like, pull the lever or not, according to whatever your culture prescribes as its norm. So if you live in a society that says, do what's good for the greatest number, then you save the 5. If you live in a society that says, no, don't act if it's going to hurt people, then maybe you just do nothing and it'll save the 1. It would depend, and both of those could be true. They would be true in different societies, because it's only true. The norm is only a norm relative to the society that you're coming from. So what are some advantages of relativism? So we have the idea here that morality is something human. So by connecting the moral system to each human society, we're acknowledging that these are human constructs, that humans made them, and humans determine them, basically. Also, relativism is straightforward and scientifically respectable. So what does this mean? Well, you could just look at different societies and see what those different societies say is the right thing to do. And that's just a description of what is the right thing to do, whatever those societies say. So that's we can sociologically study morality that way. Also, relativism is a good explanation for the possibility of moral knowledge. How is that the case? Well, you just learn the moral knowledge from your parents and from your teachers and from other members of your society. That's how you learn it. It's not something fanciful that you pull out of metaphysics or something. It's just something that you learn from your culture, in the same way that you might learn a dance, or the same way you might learn a language, or any cultural thing, right? The rituals of a society. Morality would be no different from all of those other rituals of society. Also, relativism seems to have an intrinsic support for a policy of tolerance. So when we're looking at these different societies, we can say something morally tolerant, which is, oh yeah, that is the right thing to do relative to their culture. They're just following their culture's standards of morality when they do those things. So under relativism, there's no universal morality that can be used to critique all of the specific cultures. There's just different cultures, right? So whenever we are looking at cultures, we look at them as a culture and look at their practices relative to that culture. Now we're going to see this policy of tolerance actually is not as good as it sounds. We're going to see that when we talk about the disadvantages, though, of relativism. So what are some disadvantages? So one disadvantage relates directly to tolerance again. So the problem is, if a culture's deepest values support intolerance, then in that society being tolerant is immoral. So this is hard because sometimes it seems like we want to criticize the intolerance of other people. But moral relativism doesn't give us any grounds for criticizing intolerance, because to them, that's the right thing to do. To them, the right thing to do is to be intolerant. And we could never say anything against that, because as a relativist, we would be saying that I can't critique their culture except from the standards of another culture, right? There's no way to stand back and say that their intolerance is bad because it's only relative to the culture. I could say, in our culture, we don't do that. In our culture, we are tolerant, and we should be tolerant. But because we're a relativist, that also only applies to our culture. So we can't criticize those other cultures. And if we did, we're just criticizing them from the standpoint of our culture. So that seems like a serious disadvantage for being a relativist. Relativism also implies that a culture's fundamental moral code is infallible, incapable of being mistaken. So this also seems like a serious issue. In a previous lecture, we went over the difference between conventional and critical morality. According to relativism, it doesn't seem like there can be a critical morality. There's just conventional morality. And that seems wrong. It seems like whatever our moral code is, we should be able to criticize it and find better codes, basically. And if we can't, then it has a further trouble, which is the trouble of accounting for progress in our moral beliefs. So if we're infallible, then there's no grounds on which to change our moral beliefs. So there's not going to be any progress in moral beliefs if we just think that the beliefs we already have are the right ones. But it seems like that's giving up a lot. We're saying that there's no progress. Well, it seems like we want there to be moral progress. It seems like we want to be able to get better. Another disadvantage of relativism is that if different societies disagree, then members of each society are speaking the truth. So essentially, there's no way to decide disagreements. To society A, it's true. To society B, it's false. That's just the way it is, relative to each society, right? And there's no like further way to determine who's right and who's wrong, because they're both right according to the standards of the society. But it seems like we probably don't want to say that. We want ways to solve disagreements. We want to be able to come to agreements and to determine what is true, so that everybody can essentially come to terms with that, right? So it seems like the relativist is giving something up here by not allowing for that. Relativism also faces a dilemma. The dilemma goes like this: if moral claims are taken literally, then relativism generates a contradiction. If moral claims are instead veiled reports of cultural commitments, then contradictions disappear, but cross-cultural disagreement becomes impossible. So, just above we said that there's no way for cultures to find a way to resolve their disputes, right? What this is saying here, though, is, so if we take moral claims literally, so basically if we're just taking them as statements that can either be true or false, and one culture thinks that it's true and one culture thinks it's false, then this is directly a contradiction, because it can't be both true and false at the same time. That's a contradiction. But then what we can do to avoid the contradiction is we can say, well, it's true relative to us and it's false relative to them. But then if we're saying that, we get rid of the contradiction. But we just can't have cross-cultural dialogue, because any cross-cultural dialogue will always have the conditional that it's relative to us. So we'll just be talking past each other, because everything we say will just be relative to us, and everything they say will just be relative to them. It will be like we're speaking different languages. And lastly, a disadvantage of relativism is that the relativists are forced to choose between an allegiance to the larger society and to their particular subculture. So this is raising the question, which is a good question, of where does the society begin and where does it end? So let's say you live in your city. Is your city your society? Well, you also live in your country, right? Well, is your country a different society? And also, we forgot your family. You might live with your family. Is your family a different society? Are all three of those societies at the same time? So which one, if they all have different ideas about what's good and bad, which one do you follow? Do you follow your family? Do you follow your city? Do you follow your country? It's not clear unless the relativist makes it more clear. It's not clear which one you should be following, actually, because you're just you're 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 always relative to the group, but the group can be defined in numerous different ways. So essentially, you're finding yourself having allegiances to groups of different sizes, and those groups might not all agree. That feels like a different problem that the relativist has to deal with. So let's look at error theory now, and look at error theory's answer to the trolley problem. So unlike the previous theories, which did give answers to the trolley problem, the error theorist is basically going to say that there is no answer. Pull the lever or not, there is no right or wrong answer to moral questions of such a kind. Because as we've talked about earlier, the error theorist basically thinks that moral questions are all false. They're all about unicorns. There's nothing true to be said when we're talking about morality. So, because of that, there wouldn't be anything true to be said when we're talking about the trolley problem. You may personally have a preference, which one you do, but you can't say that that's moral. You can't say, well, that I did that because morality demanded it. You would just be doing it because you had a preference, and you can't that it would be true that you had a preference, but you can't appeal to morality as the reason. All right, so what are some advantages of error theory? So the first advantage is from something called the argument from disagreement. So the basic intuition here is that well-informed, open-minded, rational people persistently disagree about moral claims. So because people disagree, rational people disagree, it seems like maybe that's evidence to think that there really is no right answer to moral questions. You think A, I think B. We contradict each other, but we're both like intelligent people who have thought about this a lot. So maybe there just really is no right answer to that question. Well, that kind of argument has some appeal, though it doesn't seem foolproof, because if we think about other things, if we wouldn't want to make that same conclusion. So you may disagree about what the correct theory of physics is. Let's say some physicists debate these questions, right, about physics. But that doesn't mean that there's no right answer. Just because they disagree about it, maybe someday we'll find more evidence and we'll find the right answer to all the theories of physics, and then we'll know which one is right. Just because we disagree now doesn't mean we'll never find the answer. So that's one pushback of this. Though you could also say, well, science is converging. It seems like scientists used to disagree more, and now they disagree less than they used to. So if science is converging, that's kind of evidence to say that science at least is moving away from disagreement. Whereas with morality, can we say the same thing? Is morality converging? And that's a harder sell. That's harder to say that people are agreeing more about moral questions. Some moral questions we agree about, seemingly, but some moral questions are still very debatable. So it's not clear that we can compare those things in that way. And so this is a potential advantage of error theory, this disagreement. Another theory people talk about is a thought that morality can be objective only if God exists, but God does not exist. So this would be an argument that so this would be an argument like if you accept something like divine command theory, then you would say that morality is just identical with whatever God commands. And that's just what morality is. So the error theorist in to the divine command theory is almost saying that God doesn't exist. They could be saying that, right? That God doesn't exist. So if you are an atheist, then you might be inclined to think, well, I'm an atheist, and because I'm an atheist, I should also be an error theorist. This would only be true though if you were an atheist who accepted divine command theory. Ironically, you'd be saying morals just are what God commands, but God doesn't exist, therefore morals don't exist, basically. So this could be an advantage if you are inclined to be atheistic about it. Though if you aren't inclined to be atheistic, then maybe this would not be an advantage, actually. Another argument is the argument from the scientific test of reality. So the intuition behind this argument is that science cannot verify the existence of objective moral standards. So this is interesting and seemingly true, right? That we can't take a microscope and look at the morals, right? That morals are not the kind of thing that can be studied like physical properties can be studied. So if we're good scientists and we just think that we should only believe things that science can tell us, then maybe we should object morality and be error theorists. That would be an interesting way to argue for error theory. Though the problem here would be something like, well, maybe there are actually things that are true, but science can't tell us that they're true. We can't prove it scientifically, but it's still true. If morality was one of those kinds of things, then that would be an objection to this argument, because we wouldn't scientifically study morality. Morality is not the kind of thing that we study scientifically. Maybe it's more like math, right? Interestingly, numbers are, we tend to think that math is true and that numbers are real, even though like we've never seen a number in nature. We can't see a number in the same way that we see a house or something like that, right? Because numbers are the kind of thing, you can see 4 houses, you can see 4 apples, you can see 4 chairs, but you can't see 4, right? Just 4. You always are seeing 4 of something. So maybe morals are like numbers, where you never see the moral, you just see it in the same way that you see a number. You see people behaving morally, maybe, and that's what you see, but you don't see the moral itself, if that makes sense. But depending on whether you buy that whole tangent about numbers and all that, if you don't buy that, then maybe you could run with this argument from the scientific test of reality, and just that would be an advantage for an error theorist. All right, we also have the argument from categorical reasons. The intuition here is just that there are no categorical reasons. There's nothing that we have reason to do. There's nothing we have reason to do categorically, which is to say, just like in all cases. If it's true that we have nothing that we have reason to do categorically, then maybe there is no morality because there's no universalizable moral system. Now, whether or not there are categorical reasons is something that we'll have to talk about in much more detail. But there's at least some doubt that there are categorical reasons, right? Is there anything that you have, like, you could ask yourself, is there anything that you have reason to do no matter what? If you can think of one of those, that something you have reason to do no matter what, then maybe you do believe that there are categorical reasons. But if you can't think of one, then maybe you would accept this argument, and that would be an advantage for the error theorist. All right, disadvantages for the error theorist. We'll talk about one. So it seems to either be self-defeating or toothless. The error theory does. And what do we mean by that? Well, either we should believe the error theory, which is a contradiction, or we should not believe the error theory, which gives us no reason to. So let's parse that out. So if we should believe the error theory, then we're saying that we should do something. But saying that we should do something is a moral claim, right? We're saying we should do it. It's moral to do it. But then if we're saying there's a moral claim that we should do it, then we're not an error theorist because we're making a moral claim. So that's a contradiction. It's like we're saying we should do something, but we are saying there's no reason that we should do it. So it's like we're saying the thing and its opposite at the same time. That's a contradiction, and that's self-defeating. But let's say we don't think that we should be error theorists. Well, if we don't think we should be error theorists, we're giving ourselves no reason to be error theorists, but at the same time, we think error theory is true. That's a confusing combination, right? We think error theory is true, but we don't think we should believe error theory is true or not true. We don't think we should do anything, but it is true. That's a strange thing, and it's toothless, because you couldn't argue to somebody that we should be an error theorist because the error theory itself would give no reason to argue to be an error theorist. It's toothless in the sense that it has no bite, right? It gives them no reason to do something. So that's a serious disadvantage for error theory, and we would have to figure out a way around either of these issues in order to sort of have a sense of what we have a sense of a coherent error theory that we can stand behind as true.